After one of the worst weeks for stocks and crypto, the total crypto market cap is down bad, and Sol just crashed below $100 for the first time in 12 months. We saw $13 trillion wiped from tech stocks in less than a month, so sentiment is understandably at an absolute breaking point right now, which is why the intelligent investors out there are looking for undervalued verticals in which they can deploy some capital, and more specifically, projects that are finding product market fit. Enter DePIN, one of the most undervalued and promising verticals at the moment, with examples like Helium's recent deal to reach 2.3 million mobile subscribers in Mexico. This intersection of telecom, energy, and compute is being rebuilt on-chain, and it might be our only hope in a sea of red. So we sat down with Helium Foundation CEO Abhay Kumar to talk about what's working, what's not working, and why DePIN might be the killer use case that everyone is sleeping on. Today, we're talking about decentralized physical infrastructure networks, or DePIN, for three reasons. The first reason is that with markets down as bad as they are, investors are naturally looking to see which tokens, which projects, and which verticals are the most resilient. And while trillions were wiped out from the stock market and Sol crashed below $100, Solana DePIN tokens showed some relative strength. And we even saw tokens like Grass and Layer were up 7.8% and 6.8% respectively. Now, the second reason here is that while some analysts are calling cycle tops, yes, we do need to be looking for growth areas within Solana, but also out there in the real world. And lastly, because, well, volatility. President Trump decided to sledgehammer the economy with tariffs, sending prices crashing. Then he announced he'll be pausing tariffs, sending prices flying. So we also need to understand how this tariff war and a potential recession will likely impact these high-growth areas in Solana like DePIN within the coming year, which of course could be challenged by rising hardware costs. And for a bonus reason in case we did need one, Austin Federa so eloquently argued that DePIN is to traditional infrastructure what DeFi is to traditional finance. And if we think about market cycles and the sheer scale of traditional infrastructure here, from telecoms to energy grids, we'll very quickly realize that the potential for disruption through DePIN is immense. But before Helium Foundation CEO Abhay Kumar tells us about the current state of DePIN, the major roadblocks that they're facing, and he gets us up to date on all the latest developments, a tiny bit of context first. Just last month, Helium Mobile rolled out a free mobile plan in Mexico through a new partnership with telecom giant Telefónica, which now gives Helium access to a potential 2.3 million new subscribers in the region. And here's what's critical to understand here. DePIN democratizes network infrastructure, and it creates a more inclusive digital economy. So the main game changer here with applying DePIN to telecommunications or energy grids is that it massively reduces overheads. And you can avoid needing to set up or maintain a massive centralized entity which requires substantial capital and overheads. And the added benefit of this, of course, is that the revenue can then be distributed more evenly throughout the network by rewarding people financially. Projects like Helium have pioneered this model by creating decentralized wireless networks powered by those individual contributors. So by setting up a Helium hotspot, people can easily provide network coverage to devices that need it, and then providers earn rewards in return. So to understand how Helium is growing so fast despite market conditions and get a better sense of where DePIN is headed, I sat down with Abhay Kumar, who's CEO of the Helium Foundation and also just a level-headed founder when it comes to filtering out some of that noise and focusing on the signal. First off, Abhay, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I want to go all the way back in time to September. It feels like a long, long time ago, but I realized something quite interesting. It was only about half a year ago, but you're on stage debating the notion of, whether or not DePIN is overhyped. Now, here we are, a few months into a Trump presidency. It's supposed to be the golden era of crypto. Price actions not quite reflected that. And people are now asking if DePIN is one of the most underhyped and undervalued verticals in Solana. So at a high level, what's going on with DePIN? What are your sort of high-level thoughts over the last 6 months, and where are we?
I think that ultimately, these are the times where you just have to double down and build. I think that, is DePIN, it's just in general, the question is much more macro than just DePIN. DePIN's a small part of crypto today. It hasn't really broke out of, on its own narrative outside of crypto, although we are definitely trying with Helium. We're trying to make the value and the utility really, really exist for folks that are not even thinking about this as a crypto project, right? Helium is for people that want connectivity, and the DePIN part of it enables that connectivity, right? 700,000 phones, use the Helium network this weekend without even thinking about it, without having to worry about a wallet or a seed phrase or anything like that. That's the kind of utility that I think DePIN can provide to the general public. And it's enabled by this, token incentive. It's enabled by these systems that we're building, at least at Helium and other projects like us.
That makes a lot of sense. And if we think about, tokens, obviously Trump's meme coin launch was quite a sort of attention grab. Do you think some of the
It
more
might have marked
important...
the top, actually, right?
Yeah, sadly, yeah. I mean, if that was the top signal, I should have absolutely sold, and I'd be in a very different place emotionally, I think, today. But I get the feeling that a lot of people in Solana feel that way. And on that, I want to ask you, to what extent do you think the important developments in DePIN have been overshadowed by some of these things like the meme coin cycle that we went through, AI agents, hype around that, Trump launching a meme coin, ETF approvals? Yeah, to what extent do all of these things overshadow some of the real development that's going on in the real world? You mentioned 700,000 people using it without realizing that they're using it. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I think about this stuff is that you just have to think about this on a much longer time scale. And this is a very maybe an old Bitcoiner sort of feeling, right? It's still too early is always the line, right? That Bitcoiners used to say, and I think that's still the case. Even Bitcoin is not yet the sort of hedge asset, right? And so it's not surprising that the macro is sort of crushing all the sort of markets, even in crypto. And so, yeah, the way I think about it is that it does matter. Ultimately, the way it directly matters for networks like ours is that people need to be incentivized for the work that they're doing. And there's sort of two parts of incentivization. There's the incentivization of the actual, utility, and then there's that bootstrap incentive that often is put into these networks in order to kickstart networks, right? So, ours is proof of coverage. So, we reward on the data transfer side and we reward on this sort of proof of coverage side. Token price does have an impact on stuff like that. But the one thing that is important is that, for us at least, we sort of try to remind folks, put the hotspot where there will be usage, because that usage will always be rewarded. And that's sort of the nature and the sort of design of Helium, is that you're always rewarded. You're rewarded in HNT, but you're rewarded for the data at the data rates that are being, sort of paid for on the network. And so, that's how we kind of absorb some of the token price shifts. And that's by design. And I think, it behooves networks that have one, build a network that actually has utility, obviously. And then two, reward for that utility first. They're the ones that should be paid first.
I like that way of thinking about it. And that sort of reminds me of another point you made on stage in Singapore during Breakpoint. You said, I'm paraphrasing this badly probably, but you said crypto is for DePIN rather than DePIN being for crypto, or something along those lines. Can you just very quickly unpack that for me? Because I think it goes to something quite fundamental about crypto and the promise of crypto that is often overlooked when we get caught up in this sort of meme coin hype cycle and Trump launching a meme coin and all these shiny things, and we miss the real point. So if you could just unpack that for me.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously a very selfish take, right? And because I'm building a DePIN. And so, I think that all of these sort of structures, there's actually an interesting way to think about this is why did we even move off of our own L1? It's because I didn't want to build all of the other stuff that you need on an L1. I didn't want to build the capital markets. I didn't want to build the lending markets. I didn't want to build the wallet integrations and the node integrations and all of those kinds of things that you have to do. Using Solana is just so much easier for a project like us that allows us to focus on the one thing that we need to be really good at, which is building a wireless network and enabling the both sort of the physical and economic expansion of that wireless network. So yeah, I love the fact that these, in some way, and as much as it might not help others to hear this, but I love the fact that you have things like Trump and the Melania token and all these things completely stressing out Solana. That's a good thing for the development of this network. It's a good thing for the development of this ecosystem because it sort of pushes everyone. The fact that, Moonshot was able to bring on millions of customers in the span of 2 days, they had to figure out a fundamental problem, which is how do you onboard? And we can learn from those kinds of things. We can learn from the infrastructure providers that are serving all the data that comes off of Solana, learns from these kind of stress events, these I guess we can call it now a black swan event, but at the time we were very euphoric about it, right? I think that, but it's an event, right? And these events sort of push the limit. I mean, last year, if you remember in February of 24, Ore was crushing the network, right? And that was these are the kinds of things that that provide at least utility to the infrastructure builders that want to know what they need to build next in that network. Unlike a network like Bitcoin, the job's not done yet, right? I think, and that's the sort of same take that I have for Helium, which is our job's not done yet. We need to know what are the stressors as well. We need to know what are the things that will make it hard to get from today the mobile network has like 90,000 hotspots. What does 900,000 hotspots look like? What does 9 million look like? What does 90 million look like? And so on, right? 700,000 users, cool. What's 7 million users? And our end goal is to get to every human, right? So we need to get to the billions. And so like, what are the sort of checkpoints and what are the sort of points that we need to grow into? So like, yeah, like crypto is for DePIN. And back to that point, I think the things that we're learning in our ecosystem, the things that are being built in our ecosystem are for me as a dev and the ecosystem.
I like that way of thinking about it. And I'm going to throw a little spanner in the works here. Tariffs, obviously, when you're building anything that has physical components that get shipped all around the world. And then on top of that, you're thinking about scaling to, from 700,000 to 7 million, 70 million users. To what extent are these tariffs really going to just halt development for DePIN?
I don't know if it's a halt. I think it's a re-rating, right? And I think that, what we need to do why does it matter for us? It's because we build and deploy, and we build hardware, we design hardware that other people build and deploy and send out to the world. So far, there's sort of two sort of angles that I've been thinking about this. One is that, yes, like our hardware, there are some components that are made in China. There's some, components that are made in other parts of the world. A lot of manufacturing is essentially like one switch gets made here, gets shipped to this place, and then, gets assembled here, and then gets to this other place and gets boxed here. And each one of those like sort of touch points, potentially has a risk of tariffs. And, we're not the only ones that are affected by this. There's, anyone who makes anything from a hardware perspective is going to be affected by this stuff. I know there's a couple of companies out there that are sort of looking at assembling fully here in the US or building entirely here in the US. So it can have an impact there. But I think the other part of this that I'm excited about, at least for Helium, is, we're also pushing on this idea of reconfiguring your existing hardware, right? So if you have a Unify wireless AP that's already deployed in a site, in a restaurant, or like a venue of any kind, we can reconfigure those things to support the Helium network. That's an opportunity for us, I think. And I think we have that Unify sort of firmware update, or the sort of configuration update that you can do today. We have it for Cisco. We have it for a couple of other sort of pieces of hardware as well. I think that's an opportunity for us to continue to grow using existing hardware that's already deployed. It's kind of great, right, to think about that. Like, you're not wasting infrastructure then. And so I think like reusing is something that I think is an opportunity in the short term, at least as like we figure out what's happening.
Interesting. You mentioned some of the partnerships there, and one that I'm most interested in is the recent news that came out of Mexico.
Yeah, the Telefónica deal in Mexico is really like a culmination of 2 years of work so far. I mean, I think that's sort of how long it's been going. What it is very directly is that Movistar, which is Telefónica's unit in Mexico, their customers will be able to use the Helium network directly when they're in range of a Helium hotspot that's deployed there. And the goal there is that 2 million customers can almost immediately start using it and expand as they continue to expand. It's really like, the way I look at it is that it's the brand Telefónica, which is very well respected, across the world, both in Europe and South America, them sort of saying very explicitly that they are ready to use this new kind of network, right? Because it has a value to their customers. Better connectivity, better bandwidth, a differentiated way to build out their network. It's kind of the other side of what Helium Mobile is doing in the US, right? Helium Mobile is being kind of a first-party subscription product, like their consumer product. It's the other version of it that's happening in the US already, the 700,000 users, for example. We haven't announced any of the actual carriers that are using this network so far, and I'm sure we will over the coming months as we sort of work through those relationships. But it's that, but Telefónica just being the first to put their name out there, saying they're going to use this network. They're happy to use this network, and they're ready to do it in Mexico, and hopefully beyond, right? Like, we're hoping that this is a template for other countries as well, and this is sort of one of the ways that we can expand into other countries.
That was my next question. Of course, South America, Central America, much bigger than just one country. So I'm guessing there's some other countries, some other partnerships in the pipeline there.
We haven't publicly talked about any particular countries, but LATAM is really interesting, I think, in general. Asia is also very interesting. I think just in general, the way that I think about it is aware. There are a couple of metrics that we think about. One is like, what is the wholesale data cost in some of these countries? And what is our ability to deploy in these countries? And who's on the ground able to deploy there? Mexico is a very, in some ways kind of convenient, right? It's our adjacent country. And we had this kind of long-standing conversation that we'd had going with them. We announced at the end of the pilot that we're going into this sort of expanded partnership. And that allows us to sort of show that as a case study. Like, here's how you could build this in your country as well. Now, how could you build this in Southeast Asia? How could you build this in East Asia? How could you build this in the Middle East or in Europe? Like, these are all places that we're open to doing and already having conversations in many of these places.
What's the biggest challenge then? What's holding us back?
I think it's like traditional sort of deployment models are the ones that people are used to. I think definitely crypto is new and sort of confusing to folks. I think all of these things will change over time. And it's just a matter of showing the work, right? Like us showing that there's terabytes of data going over the Helium network. And here's the cost savings for a carrier if they were going to launch a new carrier or expand their existing carrier. Like that's the work that we're just starting to do. So I think it's just that 90,000 hotspots is not a massive network yet, but it's showing the sort of beginnings of what we should show on the mobile side.
So overall, you sound pretty bullish. You think we're getting there, we're moving in the right direction, and you're not too worried about the sort of short-term noise or tariffs or any of these externalities, it seems.
No, I don't think so. And one of the good things, potentially lucky things that we have is we have enough hotspots that we can deliver to folks that want to deploy, right? Like it's not like, hold on, we got to wait a couple of months for these tariffs to go by before we can sort of import more hotspots to the US. So at least in the US, we have sufficient inventory between Helium Mobile, between Nova Labs' hotspot, and then also Rack, who's making hotspots. I think we'll be able to serve the demand, at least in the short term, barring someone, wanting to place like 1 million hotspot order, and then we'll have to figure it out.
Hopefully you have a problem like that. It sounds like a pretty decent problem.
It's a high quality problem.
Yeah. What's something that people get wrong about DePIN? And the sort of the main reason why I'm curious what your take on this is because looking back over the last 12 months or so, the Grass airdrop is one example. People sort of expected to lease out or make available some of their excess bandwidth and that they would get very handsomely compensated for this. And I think a lot of people realized that actually they were just making a very reasonable amount of money by global standards, compared to what they provided. But they were very disappointed because I think they were expecting a much larger airdrop. So is that in your mind one of the biggest misconceptions in DePIN, that you're going to get sort of asymmetrically rewarded for your contributions? Or is there something else that people still get wrong?
I think airdrops are a good strategy, or probably a good strategy to bootstrap attention and bootstrap sort of your core group of contributors. But like the question for me always is like, what's after the airdrop? If we think about airdrops that have happened, and just in general, like it's like a way to, like the same way the proof of coverage is a way to bootstrap coverage for Helium, an airdrop is a way to potentially bootstrap a number of wallets that are sort of interacting with, a new network, Grass you mentioned, and others. Like there's lots of folks that have done airdrops. Like I don't think they should be singled out necessarily, probably.
Just an example that came to mind.
Yeah, but
the
like,
similarities.
Like points and airdrops and all these things are kind of interesting ways to generate hype and generate attention. The question for me always is what happens after? Are you allocating enough of your token supply for the folks who will actually continue to build after this airdrop or this moment that you have? I've worked, as I mentioned, worked in other companies before. And I always remember a great line that someone told me around going public. It's like, going public is just another liquidity event. And the work starts after. It's the same as raising money. Raising a Series A or Series B is just another event. Like the job after is to actually meet the valuation that you're expected, or sort of the expectations that were set around the valuation. Like it's all just a step, and you have to have a story for after. And I think the struggle that this is a problem that everyone shares is struggle is to try to think about what happens after and sort of be able to meet those expectations. I also think airdrops have it's hard to run a good airdrop campaign, right? Like fighting symbols is really, really tough. Maybe you have better examples of this, but I don't know if anyone's actually done a great job fighting symbols. Because I think it's it may be impossible. And the closer you get to perfection, the way I think about it is like risk is like a spectrum. You can either have kind of infinite risk or infinite loss and like a fantastic UX, or you can have zero risk or zero loss and you have a terrible UX. And your job is to find a spot in the slider that you want to target and sort of willing to accept some like lossiness in your system. And, obviously you want to try to get limit your lossiness as much as possible. This is the struggle that every one of these founders and every one of these teams have to try to figure out, right? And yeah, I don't feel like, I guess I'm lucky in that we've been a token for a while now in a funny way, right?
Yeah.
And like I feel bad, or it's a struggle for the folks that are sort of trying to think through these problems from first principles again.
What do you expect for the rest of 2025? Are we going to see immense growth in DePIN, different parts of the world? Or is DePIN maybe going to slow down and sort of react to some of these market conditions?
I mean, I know what we're going to do, which is we're going to ship. Like, that's just really simple, right? We have so much more of the world, so much more of the country first, and then so much more of the world that we want to expand coverage into. We know there's demand there. We actually launched something yesterday that shows what we called observed demand, which I think is such a great way to visualize the problem that we're trying to solve. These are Helium Mobile customers who are mapping the network in areas that don't have Helium coverage. Basically, it's a plant your flag here on the map, right, to every deployer out there. And so, why did we launch that? It's we want to tell deployers to deploy more. And here's where they can actually like provide direct coverage for Helium Mobile subscribers and indirect coverage for the 5 and 6 carriers that are also roaming on our network. That's what we intend to do, I think. And you said this earlier, like you sound bullish. It's like, yeah, I am bullish. I love, as much as it hurts, like in the short term, these kinds of markets, I think these are the markets that really, really define companies, projects, people building, and like doubling down and building right now is like the best advice I can give to anybody.
Abhay, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we catch up in one of the many, many conferences that are coming up for the rest of the year. And
sure.
Great chatting with you.
Great chatting with you too, Jack. Thanks for the time.
So DePIN is clearly one of the more practical applications of blockchain, and it's already having an impact on how we build real-world infrastructure. But it also places some of the power back into the hands of individuals and communities. Now, evidently, there are still some lingering challenges like value creation and performance that remain, but pioneers like Helium are proving that it can be done and that it can be done at scale. So do let me know what you think the impact of this ongoing tariff war, the trillions wiped from markets, and the overall macro setup means for DePIN projects going forward. And if you enjoyed this deep dive or you'd like to get more short updates on everything about Solana, you can of course subscribe to Solana Floor. And I'll see you next time for more of the very latest.